So Alan Kay is something of a legend in the world of computer science and artificial intelligence. In his early work at DARPA and Xerox, he contributed to the development of object-oriented programming and the graphical user interfaces we all use today. So in recognition of his work, he has received essentially every major award in computer science: the Draper Prize, the Turing Award, the Kyoto Prize. So we're extremely honored, Alan, and really pleased to have you here with us today and to give us your perspective on computational law. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Alan.
Thanks very much. I'm going to try sharing my screen here. And if people are seeing a strip of other windows besides me down the right-hand side, that's going to interfere with some of the materials I'm showing. But anyway, I will just start and I will let the people who are running the Zoom session decide what to do with that. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm a little rocky today because I had my second vaccination shot yesterday, but there's nothing like the adrenaline from fear in giving a talk. And this thing started off when Mike contacted me a little over a month ago, and he asked if I could do a keynote for this conference, and I didn't know what this was about and should have something to do with computers, legal systems, society of the future. And all of these interesting people in the audience, most of whose professions I'm not very aware about. And then he wanted me to do it very quickly. So of course I said, okay, why not? And I'd like to thank the people who helped me on this talk ahead of time, because it gets lost in the shuffle at the end. So you see their names here. The connections from Mike to Katie and Mark Stefik through Tim Miller to Bertram Mala were particularly useful. Thank you all. And of course, I thought of this old cartoon, being an old guy. This is a series of cartoons that were essentially gotcha cartoons. People say one set of things, then all of a sudden it turns out to be worse or different later. And the series was called There Oughta Be a Law. And the first thing I thought of when I was asked about this talk was, well, there are these 9 people who have a lot of influence in what's going on. They're all lawyers. They all have top degrees from everywhere. They're all really smart in many different ways and stuff. And the question I have is, gee, why can't these people agree on what the Constitution means? Well, the Constitution has problems, but they obviously have some problems. And my conclusion was that the problem here, and the problem that I should speak to, had much, much more to do with human beings than with the law or computers. No matter how we get things right outside of the human sphere, we have to get them right inside the human sphere because of what the law is. And yeah, talking about human beings in a computer conference, that is taking your life in your hands. But here's the Cliff Notes here. Hamlet meets 7 ± 2, meets multiple-minded, meets system 1, meets culture. Those are the 5 things I will look at here as using a kind of a theatrical metaphor for one set of dimensions on humanity. So first idea here is that our minds are very like theaters. In fact, theater works because our minds are like theaters. And the patron saint here maybe is Shakespeare. 7 plus or minus 2, well, our theaters are tiny, really, really tiny. Actually, for most things, about 4 plus or minus 3. The patron saint here is George Miller, one of the founders of cognitive psychology and who wrote the famous paper. We have many minds inside of our skull manifested by our brain. We could have as many as 80 or 90 of them. 3 that were articulated some years ago that have been particularly useful is a way of thinking about things and way of doing things that is through touch, called the inactive way of doing things. And another way of doing things is through our visual system. And I include in this our hearing system. They both are basically configurative. And then we have this very recent symbolic system that's probably only a few 100,000 years old now. And these, not just these 3 ways of doing things, but our maybe 10 or 15 or 20 different ways of doing things conflict with themselves. Patron saint here is Jerome Brunner. And our theaters inside of our heads are mostly not human. Most of the way our brain works are in common with other primates and mammals. And this is not the way we think of ourselves. So we're constantly fooling ourselves. I'll pick the patron saint here as Daniel Kahneman from Thinking Fast and Slow, very renowned Nobel Prize winner. Was basically a behavioral psychologist. And then we are immersed inside the play that is made from the cultures that we are in. And it's the nature of our genetics for us to become part of that play, especially when we're children, but at all ages. When we go to another place, we start acculturating. And we're much more shaped by this than we think. And I could pick a number of people here. I picked Marshall McLuhan because he was particularly interested in how the media that we're more and more embedded in now is a environment and a culture itself and is affecting us very deeply. I put a halo on Jerry Brunner here because he's sometimes called Saint Jerome, and one of the largest minds of the 20th century, this guy, was interested and extremely well-versed in many areas. He was one of the founders with George Miller of cognitive psychology, but his deep hobby was also anthropology, and he really spanned the gamut of human culture in so many ways. So these 5 dimensions, and some of these characters will come back again in this talk. And well, this is Puck, What Fools These Mortals Be, and we can see the Vulcans visited Earth at least 400 years ago. And what did Puck mean, or Shakespeare speaking through Puck? Well, we're easily fooled. We want to be fooled. We pay to be fooled. We fool ourselves and we pay to fool others. So the world that we actually live in is much more of a generated symbolic world in which story is the central element rather than what might actually be going on out of the world. Here's an example. mother wants to crack some nuts, and her 9-year-old son has got the nutcracker. So she starts grooming him. Because at some point she can demand of him to groom her. He says, come on. And he starts doing it. Watch what happens here. As soon as he gets both hands over there, she grabs the rock very happily. Mammals are con artists. Here's a dog that looks like he's in desperate straits. So somebody stops, tosses out some food, and whoops. So another aspect of this theatrical approach to life we have is we project our beliefs out into the world. So the Talmud has a really good line about that, is we see things not as they are, but as we are. And this, I think, is the key here for trying to deal with modern inventions, modern technology in a world that is full of us ancient human brains. Computer people could help things tremendously if they were less interested in computers and more interested in people. However, the psychology of computing, not 100%, but it caters very, very strongly to people who are uneasy with human beings. The computers seem to be much less threatening. So computer people have traditionally had a really difficult time understanding the idea that humans are supposed to be using these things. So here's an example of projection. So if we take two poker chips here and we organize them so that one is twice as far away from the other, if we look at the image on the retina, as Descartes indeed did by scraping the back of an ox's eye after the ox was dead, thank goodness. But what we see is the lens, an animal lens, actually works like a glass lens. And the image on the retina of the further away one is half the size of the closer one. Then we've got a kind of a pachinko machine called a brain here. And this information from the retina goes to lots of different places, including a place in the brain where we believe things. And one of the beliefs we have about poker chips is that they're the same size. And so this is different information than it's on the retina. And another part of this complex that we have inside of our heads, we can call the dream. It's basically a theater where many, many different parts of the processing in our brain that we're not aware of are consolidated together into something that internally is what we treat as reality. And so the compromise here is between a half size on the retina and the same size knowledge that we have. And so the dream decides that the smaller one is about 80% the size rather than 50% the size. And then we have this interesting thing is the dream is actually what we think is out there. And what we think is out there when we actually look at this, we can do it with our thumbs too. What is actually out there, we think, is something that is 80% for the further away one. And that's what we see when we look at our thumbs like this. artists get around this by measuring, by being very careful about the angles that are subtended and so forth. But this projection of what our beliefs are and our conclusions out onto the world as though it's actually happening out in the world has gotten our species in a lot of trouble over hundreds of thousands of years. It's one of the major things we have to think about whenever we're doing anything that involves either ideas, communication, or power. And McLuhan had the great line for this. It's not seeing is believing, but until I believe it, I can't see it. That is the way human perception actually works. You have to learn how to do it, and your learning might not be perfect. So the Thinking Fast and Slow book, Kahneman proposes what he calls two expository fictions, meaning they're not true, but pretending they are really helps thinking about something much more complicated. So he divides our entire mentality up into system one, which are all of the mechanisms in there designed to go really fast. Quick reactions, and most of these are done by correlations of the kind that machine learning does. They're very simple, they're not cognitive. The system one system does not really know what's going on. And then there's this system two, which is not a very good thinker, but at least it tries. It's slow, it's pondering, and makes up reasons for things. And one of the metaphors that Kahneman used in this book was our mentality is a little bit like somebody riding on an elephant, and sometimes guiding the elephant, but sometimes the elephant just wants to do something. And what system two does is to make up a reason for it as though it had come up with the motivation for doing it. So if the elephant rears up, the person, the rider of the elephant says, well, I wanted to do that. But in fact, careful brain scan studies show that much of the time, system two never got to think about it. System one just decided to do something, and system two, noticing it in this theater, came up with a reason for it. So as Robert Heinlein once said, we're not rational animals, we're rationalizing animals. Here's one of my favorite Kahneman biases. So this guy wants to catch a baboon. And you can find this video on YouTube if you want to find out why. Here's a young juvenile baboon watching with interest. He's digging a hole in this termite hill there, and he's putting some seeds in the hole. And then he backs off. Primates are curious. What is in there? Checks it out. Puts his hand in there. Grabs onto those seeds, and now he can't get his hand out because he won't let go of the seeds. He could let go of them and run away, but in fact, he's not going to let go of them. So the hunter just comes over and catches him, ties him up. The seeds, the seeds. Does this remind you of anything that you've done 100 or 1,000 times in your life? So Kahneman and Tversky put together and came up with the term cognitive biases. They started collecting weird things where we aren't thinking at all reasonably. And they came up with, I don't know, a few hundred of them. There's a good Wikipedia page for these. So Yeah, so this one was loss aversion. Favorite one here is Dunning-Kruger. These smug pilots have lost touch with regular passengers like us. Who thinks I should fly the plane? We just had a president kind of like that. But if you want Dunning-Kruger, take a look at pretty much every computer program in the planet. It is the maximum of being more confident than it should be about what it's able to do and what it's thinking. Another one, confirmation bias. We should all know that one, being researchers and academics. We look for things that support what we think is going on. We're totally story-based, even when we think we're trying to be scientific. So basically what's going on here is an enormous part of it is atavistic. And in fact, what's going on right now through Zoom is nothing more than a campfire where somebody's up there telling stories. Here's Mike checking me out to make sure I'm going to end this on time. And we're wired for stories. We use stories for so many different things, even when it's not a good idea. And Unthanhorsen here, this guy from 100,000 years ago, everything at this modern campfire would be completely familiar to him. And this is because he has pretty much the same brain that we have. He wants the same things. And if we give him a haircut and glasses and a briefcase and a modern version of a spear, which is a Tomahawk missile, basically the same thing obtains. And this is something we have to remember, that, and it's something that is used all the time in the courts and in every kind of advocacy and prosecution and defense, is turn it into a good story and you don't have to worry about the truth. Because we don't care whether the stories are true. We want them to be good and to be the way we think things should be. So Bertrand Russell wrote a book about power. And one of the major ideas in it is, hey, no matter what system you devise, you need to arrange to allow the most able, energetic, and aggressive to prosper, or they will game it to death and eventually undo it. And there's a lot of contention right now with people simply trying to get their own way by gaming things. And the law has to be above that, but it isn't. This pamphlet was key to the direction that our country took. And it's a joke because it in fact is not about what common sense was at all. Common sense was you should have a monarchy. But what he tries to do is come up with a new common sense. And one of the great principles in there, he says, instead of having the king be the law, we can have the law be the king. Meaning, we should be able to invent a better society than we just blundered our way into. And so this pamphlet, which 900,000 went out to 1.5 million colonists in the first 6 months, right before the Declaration of Independence, was one of the most influential pieces of writing in American history. And then this great book by Anthony Amsterdam, who is a Supreme Court litigator and a distinguished lawyer and legal theorist. Many of you will know of him. And Jerry Brunner. Jerry lived so long. Jerry lived just slightly past the age of 100. And so he had many different careers, and he spent 10 years in the NYU Law School as a professor. This is one of the books that they came up with. And their aim is to make what is familiar strange again, which is the #1 job, I think, for any university. The toughest people to give a talk to are people who know something, because they often know it only too well. And it talks, for a person who doesn't know a lot about the law, this is one of the best introductions to what it's really about. But what was interesting is that the thrust of this book, what they looked at to make up the book, was what the Supreme Court actually does and did and has done, and how much what they've done has not been particularly logical at all, but has been organized around different kinds of storylines and narrative. And I think understanding narrative, being able to generate narrative, to be able to deal with narrative on a human scale is critical for any attempt to be serious about computing in the law. So here's an example of what is sometimes called the private universe from NSF a few years ago. Right after the Harvard commencement, they went around and asked some questions.
Despite a lifetime of the very best education, students in our classrooms are failing to learn science. Many of these students will graduate from college with the same scientific misconceptions that they had on entering grade school. To test how a lifetime of education affects our understanding of science, we asked these recent graduates some simple questions in astronomy. Consider, for example,
how hot it is or how cold it is at any given time of the year has to do with the closeness of the Earth to the sun during the seasonal periods.
The Earth goes around the sun, and it gets hotter when we get closer to the sun, and it gets colder when we get further away from the sun.
Now, after I saw this, I had taught a class at UCLA, so I went and asked some of the students if they'd come outside with me to talk about both the phases of the moon question and the seasons, because NSF had not thought to ask, for instance, this guy, well, do you know when it's summer up here in the Northern Hemisphere, do you know what the season is in the Southern Hemisphere? And all the students I talked to knew it was winter. And all of a sudden they realized, oh, the distance to the sun can't be the main thing about the seasons. And to those who thought the Earth got in between the moon and the sun to cause the phases of the moon, I asked them if they'd ever seen the sun and the moon in the sky at the same time. And of course we have on many occasions, and the moon is usually in phase. And so the Earth cannot possibly be between there. So I think we can get two ideas from this, that the major curriculum at Harvard, at least, is Confidence 101. And from the time I spent at Stanford, I would say that that's true there also. But the other thing is that what NSF was exploring as a knowledge problem is not just a knowledge problem, but it's a cognitive problem. And we have to thank the Harvard students for not having the knowledge, because the cognitive problem is that they had seen in their lives, every single one of them, counterexamples to what their main theory was. And none of their training in their entire life had set them up with the heuristic to try and compare what it is that they did know about the Earth and the planets. So this is a much bigger failure than simply not knowing something. So this gives rise to this private universe idea that we have very different worlds in our brains, we project them out on the world, and we have trouble communicating. So a mane and hooves and tail, well, not necessarily a horse. And in fact, in med school, people who come up with the zebra from that description are called zebras. They're people who come up with the most complicated diagnosis rather than the one that's the most obvious. But for these two kids, they can eventually get to agree on what a hamburger is. It comes into their shared space. And we can see that words are kind of an invention that allows us to point to things that are in our jointly shared imagination. So language came after the gesture. So if we go to an upgrade of this campfire, because the theater grew out of what happened in campfires, we notice this interesting thing about storytelling in general, and that is that the audience's intelligence is relied on to make sense of what's happening, even in a movie. So the only intelligence in the room is the audience there, and you have to do something in this shared space to get the audience to understand what you want them to understand. And the theater is sometimes called the magic mirror precisely because its job, the job of this kind of media, is to beam the audience's intelligence back out at them. And we can see that this is one of Brunner's mentalities, iconic. In fact, if you take acting lessons, the first thing they'll get you to do is not just pantomime, but to learn how to pose. Because posing is the center of what the theatrical art is about. There are words. And in fact, we can get rid of everything except the words by inventing writing. And this puts a real burden on the audience. The audience has to do a lot of learning, but the learning they do helps them think differently and changes the way civilization turns out. When a computer comes on the scene, it's inherently a backstage kind of thing. It doesn't have a story to tell. So you have to provide some kind of a story. This is what we did at Xerox Parc, which will be familiar to you today. And it uses both the iconic and the symbolic mentalities of Brunner and the fact that we can touch it, and we even made some interfaces that could touch back. So the idea here with relevance to this conference is pretty much, I think, what comp law should be about right now is primarily user interface for something more complicated than what we were doing at Xerox Parc. And you make progress by inventing an entirely new environment, not just doing little experiments. This interface worked because its semantics was grounded on itself. It was about itself. It wasn't about the outside world. And the object-oriented stuff we did at Xerox Parc was able to create an ontology that allowed the system to be very self-explanatory and exploratory in various ways. But if we take something like Montesquieu's Spirit of Laws and put it on a computer, we can read it as a book. But for most of us, I remember reading this book years ago, and it was a real struggle. Most of us want an AI or something that can really help us learn. So the user interface is not just about access to functions. It's also about learning and exploring and getting more versed in what is an entire world that you're giving the user to live in. And the grounding problem is well put by Einstein when he compares mathematics, which is not grounded in anything except itself, and science, which has to be grounded in reality. And so you can use math and science as long as you realize your grounding is not going to be perfect and that your main job is to find the groundings that allow you to use mathematical logic to come to conclusions about the real world. Well, okay. So in order to point to something in our shared space, we have to imagine the same things, and it's very likely that's what these cave paintings were about. And it's not that we don't imagine things. We can imagine angels. 77% of us believe there are angels. 94% of us believe there are supreme beings. Too many of us believe in human sacrifice still going on. About half of us, pretty much everywhere, believe in witches and demons. I mean, in demons and ghosts. 21% still believe in witches. You can look up the Great Cat Massacre, when they decided the cats were the witches in France in the 17th century. We believe in war. We can imagine war. And we can imagine something going wrong when we're vaccinated. So we have all of these things we can imagine and talk about, and people do. But most of us have had a hard time imagining tiny little viruses. And the devastating deaths are precisely the result of not understanding something that a small percentage of scientists and anybody who understood their 8th grade biology course would understand. So this current schooling has failed disastrously, and because there are second and third waves, societal learning from the first waves and thinking have also failed. And of course, even smaller is the carbon dioxide molecule. And we're flunking this test really badly. This is the sleeper one. Okay, I had a rant here, but I decided I would just ask you in this conference to consider the following 2 questions. How weak is the current state of the art of computer-generated explanation and computer-assisted learning, especially compared to what it was 40 years ago? It got up to a certain state 40 years ago. It's gotten slightly better since then, but I couldn't find anything like what I expected. And what seems to be going on is somehow a lot of researchers are like this guy who lost his keys back here and prefers to search under the light. And well, he found a skate key, has machine learning and semantic web on it. And if you keep on working on that, you might get a better skate key. The problem is you're not going to get the access to the vehicle you wanted in the first place. So, yeah, this is the symbol I put on my slides to quit talking. No more about that. Okay, so now I'll finish up with what I think is some bright prospects. First, thanks to Tim Miller for bringing this book by Bertram Mala to my attention. I think it's terrific. He considers himself a cultural psychologist. He was inspired by Brunner. And it's a book about the way people try to explain things to themselves and to others, and gives a kind of what you might call a common sense framework for thinking about the way humans actually go about understanding and doing things. And there are other books that he's been associated with. So it's all about what can we agree on? How do you find meanings with the private universes? And many, many different topics that I've not seen treated quite this way before. In the our field, I think only a few of these have actually been treated in AI. So there are many, many other ways to look at it. And an example of an enormous effort over decades with tens of millions of relationships and ways of inferring things is, of course, Psych by Doug Lennon. And this is worth looking at, again, not because it's the answer to today's problem so much, but because of what's in it is hard to escape having to have answers for. And it's the only large-scale artifact of its kind that I know of that has that could actually be talked about. And many things have happened about the theory of causality over the last 40 years, including the work of Judea Pearl. And then finally, there are new user interface people on the scene. The user interface is probably at its lowest level in computing that it's been for a long time, except there are people like Brett Victor here, who is just an amazing talent. So if you look at these four things here, we've got a framework for thinking. We've got ways of dealing with the areas of logic that we can deal with. We've got examples of huge artifacts that are going to be required in order to do cognitive AI. It's not that there isn't going to be machine learning as part of it, but having machine learning be the central part is the tail wagging the dog. And then finally, there are some great user interface thinkers on the scene. So I think you need to make a platform. I think these are four starting places. If I were going to do such a platform, I think these are the four places I would start. I'd look for some sort of vector sums of these four dimensions, get everybody involved in a new grand challenge and synthesis, and make the center of it dealing with critical issues in a world where humans are considered to be important. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for running over a little bit, but that's the best.
Alan, thank you so much for this wonderful, very human-centric framework you've given us as a wonderful basis for the rest of our conference. So we very much appreciate you and appreciate you taking the time for sharing your ideas about the world of law and technology. And yeah, please accept, my applause as an applause on behalf of the over 600 people who I'm sure share the enthusiasm about your keynote. So thank you so much for joining us.